Geology, geology, geology. Welcome everybody to the Mini Geology Show. This is Daniel Minizini, your inquisitive geologist here from Houston. Today, Beauty of Oil. Beauty of Oil is a research collective dedicated to understanding the complexities and paradoxes of the Petro Modernity. You know something about the Petro Modernity because we live in the Petro Metro, right? So with us we have Alexander Klose, a cultural theorist, curator, and concept developer based in Berlin. Here is Alexander in Berlin where it is snowing. Hi, Alexander.
Hi, Daniel. Nice to see you.
And we see us in here through the connections of the virtual reality. Also, we have Benjamin Steininger, a cultural theorist and historian of science and technology. He is living in Vienna, so he's connected from the capital of Austria. How's it going, Benjamin?
Very well. Hi, Daniel. Great to see you.
All right, so we have Alexander and Benjamin. There is a trio in this Beauty of Oil, as we said, is a collective. So the third would be Bernd Offengarten, maybe.
Almost, you've got it. Almost.
Help me with that. Tell me exactly how you pronounce Bernd's last name.
Hopfengärtner.
A designer and futurologist. He's also based in Berlin. So we said that Beauty of Oil is a research collective dedicated to understanding the complexities and paradoxes of Petro Modernity. Let's start from the basics. What is Petro Modernity?
Well, it's obviously the modern society, but it's the modern society understood through the lens of its main energy resource that it's using. So if we look at modernity, which has been going on for roughly 200 years, then there's, so to say, two phases. One is the coal. First part of fossil modernity would be the coal phase in the 19th century with big engines, big technology, first phase of industrialization and also centralization. And then there's the second phase, which is mainly was shaped and still is shaped by the use of oil and oil technologies and also all kinds of materialities derived of oil, and also characterized by processes of decentralization and industrialization. So this is what we basically understand as petromodernity, a time that has been going on for roughly 100 years now, and that started with a combustion motor, I would say.
Who coined this word?
I would say it's among cultural theorists. I see it around since, let's say, 2 decades. There is quite a large community in Northern America and in the Anglo-Saxon world dealing with petro-modernity as a new way of shaping the perspective on modernity. Modernity is normally understood as a cultural topic, as a special epoch in human and cultural history, but petromodernity makes it clearer that this is not only something that has to do with, let's say, human history, but that also history of materials and of resources.
And also Houston, by the way, is one of the centers of critically thinking about petromodernity at Rice University. Dominic Boyer and the people, and they started to use this term, and they have started to use it maybe 15 or 20 years ago. I would say 15 years ago, but it works retroactively and starts, you could start maybe already with Rockefeller, but I would propose to start with the invention, like I said, of the combustion engine and of the car. And then First World War, the story that, the English Navy switched from coal to oil, and then actually the whole thing really accelerated and took off, I would say, with exploration going on all around the world and a new colonial and post-colonial setup, so to say, and a heavy use, the starting of the heavy use of oil products.
Now, in your introduction, the introduction of your collective, you say that you dedicate your time to understand the complexities. Can you explain what are the complexities and the contradictions in this petromodernity?
One of the very interesting paradoxes that is apparent, is already apparent in the world, Petro Modernity. So it is the most modern and the most ancient. The fact that the most modern technologies are based on the most ancient resources is already somehow contradictory, but it refers also to other contradictory features, let's say, of the modern epoch, so that it has some kind of dialectics between progress and between very ancient and also destructive components. So let's say totalitarianism is also part of modern time as enlightenment. And so the Petro modern aspect of modernity adds something to this complex and contradictory history concept of modernity itself. The complexities, you learn something about the complexities when you just sum up the disciplines that deal with petro-modern technologies. You have chemistry, you have geology, you have all types of life sciences. All those sciences deal with this type of resources because all aspects of modern life are influenced by this type of resources, of the energy, of the materials that are produced by fossil materials. So it is complex because everything has to do with it.
Benjamin, I see that one of the main contradiction you mentioned, the fact that oil is one of the oldest things and modernity is one of the newest, that is simple and related to etymology. What about if we use the solar energy? The sun is even older than the oil. So where is the contradiction in here?
I think the interesting thing, I mean, talking or thinking about the sun, you could also introduce a notion of historicity because the rays take some time to get from the sun to the earth. But we would probably say they are arriving all the time, and they have been for quite a while, and they are, so to say, ahistorical. The interesting thing about using up fossil fuels is that we produce a shortcut between human history and Earth's geological history. And I think that is so significant about it, you know, that a substance that has used millions of years to develop, you know, starting with the collection of the energy of the sun, actually, and at the first instance, and then all these kinds of decomposition processes and transformation and intensification process. And then at the end, there's this substance that is so highly energetic. And then we basically use it up in technologies that, you know, that use it up within seconds. Within seconds, you use up, or within microseconds, you use up, so to say, a million years. I think this is kind of mind-boggling, this relation. And that's also different from the relation you would have with the sun, where you would say, well, it's all encompassing anyway, you know, it's there anyway. You don't use it up. You can't use up the sun rays, but you can use up the oil resources.
I see. I understand the concept behind this. So the grain time gap that is between the maturation of the oil and the use of it, which could be millions of years. But in reality, like the sun rays, they arrive every day. Also, the hydrocarbons leaks and seeps. They are every day flowing out of the earth to the surface. Just think about the burning bush of the Bible, but also all the leaks that they are pervasively bubbling up from the bottom of the ocean to the surface, and all the satellites that they are tracking that, which, by the way, is one of the main elements for the petroleum geologists to find where there could be an accumulation of oil, because nature is telling you, look, we are leaking in here a little bit of bubbles of gas and oil, and that means that below the surface you have a hydrocarbon accumulation. So would this change your point of view?
It would not change. I mean, the interesting thing is not that a contradiction is something forbidden. A contradiction is something interesting, and it leads you somewhere where you normally would not be. So the fact that, let's say, something about the natural dynamic, about geological dynamics of the Earth that existed way before humans, is only a subject of science because we use this oil. So we decipher natural history because we have a certain technological need, and we look differently on those bubbles in the sea than all humans before, because we have a technological use of this material, and that's why we need sciences that deal with this type of deep history. This is, you could put this under the umbrella of a contradiction between, let's say, cultural theory and technology, or ancient and modern, or fossil, or high-speed time frames. But it's something that you need to draw very different things together to understand this epoch that we are living in. And this is, I think, the fascinating thing with Petro Modernity and with all the sciences that deal with this epoch.
I would like to add a personal story in order to, where we started from, and how we actually arrived at using this term. Both Benjamin and I grew up in Germany at the time when the whole wave or line of thinking of environment protection and environmental awareness actually started to get bigger. And as you are maybe familiar with, Germany was one of the countries where this actually was very strong from the 70s on. And we had the Green Party in the late 70s and so on. And so we grew up in a way of looking on this political struggle where people tended to take a side that pretended to be able to, so to say, stay out of petromodernity. You could put your fingers on it and say, look at all those bad things that are happening because of oil. Look at the wars, look at geopolitics, all the cynicism, look at the destruction, look at the environmental catastrophes, the oil leakages, the tanker catastrophes. You can go on and on and on. We're all aware of that. And then also at these times already, there was the beginning, it started, the awareness of climate warming and so on already started. But the problem of this kind of critique was that it took a standpoint that is actually impossible in the time, because obviously if you really start thinking about it, you get to the conclusion that, as Benjamin already said, for, so to say, the epistemological area of it, that a whole lot of this knowledge that we have about it is only, so to say, due to the fact that it is extracted all the time, and that there is so much money invested in it, and that so much technology is built around it, and that also that so much wealth and value surplus, so to say, has been gained during this epoch, that produced also probably and is financing, as in the case of Rice University and as the center of critical petromodern thinking, and is also financing its own critique. So in order to get a full picture of this time, we have to acknowledge it. We can't, that's why we call ourselves Beauty of Oil, and why we said, okay, we have to look at both sides, because in our tradition of thinking, coming from a more left liberal, environmental aware line of thinking, it has been very clear for a very long time that you stay, so to say, on the other side of the barricade, and that you don't want to have anything to do with all those relentless car drivers and so on. But that just doesn't make sense anymore. If we want to somehow leave this era because it has so many problematic aspects, then we have to acknowledge also all its positive outputs in order to, so to say, to do it, and we have to do it together. That's basically, it's a whole society effort.
So you say that the name Beauty of Oil, it is almost like poking society, and especially that's that part of the society where you come from, saying, hey guys, look, you say things are bad, but you know that because of the oil itself. So beauty of oil is a name that highlight the contradictions. Is that right?
Yeah, you got it totally right. You know, we were thinking about actually the name for an exhibition. You know, we are working on a large exhibition project in the town where the Volkswagen is built, by the way, in Wolfsburg. So in the Lion's Den, in a way, in Germany. And we were thinking about the name, the title for this exhibition to put through our approach as fast as possible, as a title should do it. And we thought, well, everybody, at least in a country like Germany, and with the audience, with an expected audience for that type of exposition, everybody will think of the horror anyway. So, you know, in order to make clear that we have a much more complex attitude, should be dealt with much more complexity, we decided, well, maybe we can just leave out, at least for our name, we can leave out the horror and just, you know, highlight the beauty, and that will make it actually more interesting. Exactly like you say, towards those critical discourse spheres or whatever, who still kind of repeat an approach where we think, well, you know, that's too easy. It's just way too easy to always assume we know everything and we know who the bad guys are.
So, and Benjamin, sorry, I call you Benjamin, in German is Benjamin, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry about that, Benjamin. So correct me, please, if I say something wrong, especially about your names. So, Benjamin, if I understand well, also related to your previous sentences, so it seems that oil allowed better houses, faster communication, richer societies, and maybe because of that also more time to think. As a consequence, oil, we may say, is victim of his own success. In fact, the means of critique derive from the object of its critique. So shouldn't we build monuments to celebrate oil?
Yeah, in fact, we live in cities that are the monuments that celebrate oil, but we don't see them because like the glasses you wear and you always look through, then you don't see them anymore. So we live within the monuments, but we don't see what they mean. And so that's why we would say, well, the oil is so omnipresent that you would really also need to step back and take the most strangest standpoint that is possible, and so that you can interpret cities as monuments, as something that don't serve a purpose, but that are just, let's say, signs of what this epoch is about. So I think we don't need to build those monuments, but we should interpret real reality as a monument of this Petro modern dynamic. And it's not only monuments that are, let's say, standing around, but it's more the type of processes that are enabled by this type of new resources. So if we would like to build monuments, then it would be flying around or driving around, or this way of that everything changes very rapidly in short periods of time. So the monuments of Petro Modernity would not be built in stone or steel, but it would be something very fluid and something very dynamic.
We're here in Texas.
Yeah, well, yes and no, huh? It's also, I mean, it's also the crumbling, starting to crumble infrastructures, of course, the millions and millions and millions of square meters or kilometers or miles of asphalt and tar and pipelines and so on, that can also be considered somehow as either ruins or monuments, I mean, future ruins or monuments of Petro Modernity. I think that is also, you know, But and on one other thing I would like to add, your question is very nice because we have started to quite intensively and repeatedly give lectures on this question of cultural heritage. So that has been one of our main topics during the last months, I would say, in Norway, with Russia, with different people where we actually would have traveled to, but then did it digitally, where we every time we raise, also in the seminary I did with New York, this question of cultural heritage and how, if we imagine ourselves in the future, post-fossil and post-Petro-modern, what will happen with the monuments and with the ruins of Petro-modernity? How will people think of that time? And that's a trick also, a trick how we now can take something like an archaeological distance towards a time that we're still completely entangled by or within.
Do you like Petro-modernity? What is your standpoint, you personally, Alexander and Benjamin, on Petro-modernity?
Well, the problem is that we can't think of ourselves and of maybe all that we like without this type of resources at our disposal. So even if I say, well, no, personally, I don't like Petro-modernity, I like to travel to the south of France and live in a cave there, the only mean I could go there and I could also survive somewhere in the wilderness would come from Petro-modern materials. So it is a question that you cannot answer with I like it or I don't like it, but everything which I like and everything which I don't like is, let's say, contaminated with this type of resource. That's why I would not answer the question.
Well, but when you say the word contaminated, it already has attached a negative feeling on it.
Yeah, that's one side of the coin, but the other side of the coin is you could also say it's contaminated or enlightened by this type of resources. And I think it's really important to always see these both sides. But so, of course, from the perspective of the planet, maybe nothing less good could happen that these type of Petro-modern dynamics. So
well, but the planet doesn't have a perspective. I mean, human beings have perspective. So the Earth doesn't really care that much about what we do. It's us that we judge ourselves. So I was wondering if you have a stand on this situation, if you are just proposing these complexities and paradoxes, like in a neutral terrain, or you are actively advocating to remain in the Petro-modernity or to get out of Petro-modernity?
I would like to answer your personal question too. I'm quite sure that I wouldn't be happy at a city like Houston or LA, where you have to drive a car and you're kind of exotic if you take a walk or take your bicycle. But I love driving cars, I very much like the godlike capacities that we have all gotten because of these technologies, that we can fly around and that, so I would say, but our trick is we are definitely not advocating that we stay within Petro-modernity in terms of like, yeah, we will forever continue using up fossil fuels. I mean, of course, we're not doing that. But what we are doing is we are saying, well, this will end. And for a couple of very good reasons, it should end quite soon. But we don't want to end it in a disastrous way. And we want to keep as many of the benefits of this era, as many as the really good developments of this era as possible. And in order to do that, we first have to do a kind of survey and find out what is really a benefit of this era, because you can easily, if you say beauty of oil, you can also easily kind of just repeat the advertisement promises of the oil industry of the 1970s or 60s, when they were still very openly saying everything is oil, we can't imagine a life without oil, and so on. So probably very many things about that are right, but still we have to critically repeat those claims and ask, okay, in what respects and how much and how deeply is our way of democracy, for instance, related to the abundance of the substance and to the wealth its abundance has produced or has been producing? How much and to what extent are processes like women's emancipation of all kinds of minorities within our Western societies related to oil? Because many people claim they are heavily related, others have never thought about it, others deny it. So we have to think about it and really look at it. And in order to do that, again, you have to acknowledge first that it had a large impact. And of course, also, even if you find it tragic or something, a large positive impact. And also, you can't, even communism, the whole idea of communism and socialism, if you look closely at it and you look at the theory about materialism and so on, you find out even there you find thinking about energy resources. It's right at the cradle of it. It's already built, so to say, on fossil fuels.
What is the strongest critique that you have
on petromodernism?
Yes.
Well, that it's a very destructive way to deal with all the biosphere, let's say. It's not only the climate system, but it's with all other organisms on Earth. This is what I would say the strongest critique, that it enables humans to destroy large parts of other ecosystems. And even if we don't want to destroy these other ecosystems by the way how our economy and how our transport systems is fueled, we simply do this. This is the strongest way of critique.
What do you think about the status of petromodernity? Is petromodernity declining?
It's really tricky because the decline of petromodernity has been part of the ascent of petromodernity almost from the beginning, at least if we are talking about the peak oil discourse. So for quite a long time, this epoch has in a way theorized itself as an epoch that will be only intermediary, but the utopias or the visionaries, visions or perspectives that were related with this view, this maybe historical philosophical view, that has changed over the years. So I would say that for quite a long and decisive phase, the idea that the atomic age will be the age that will, that will follow petrol age and that will last forever, so to say, because then we are down on the atomic level, and this is where we can get down to this level of producing energy, and then we are like the sun ourselves. This has been a very strong narrative, but obviously during the last, let's say, 30 years or something, it has lost, or 40 years almost, it has lost most of its power and of its futurist velocity. So and then it all started with Club of Rome already, obviously, and there were these phases where people very strongly believed that petromodernity is already declining. For example, in the 1970s, with all this crisis discourse and President Carter telling the American people that they should prepare themselves for a time in which they have to consume less and still be happy. But then came Reagan and then the Bush administrations and so on, and also new explorations and discoveries of oil everywhere in the world. And so it started again, and the same thing happened actually only 10 years ago. And there was a very strong discourse about so to say, a natural ending of this era. And then came fracking, or 15 years ago maybe. So it's hard to say. This could go on for quite a couple of decades, I would say, if not a political ending is put to it. And then the other thing is, if you're talking about the approaches and the, so to say, the worldview, which also may be one of the very problematic aspects of petromodernity. You know, you asked Benjamin before, what do you think, what is your toughest critique towards petromodernity? And I would say it is that there is a certain colonial logic, you know, the idea to use up nature, resources and everything as resources is a sort of colonialism that I think in a way has to be overcome for the future.
Is it possible to maintain the petromodernity and getting rid of these couple of problems that are your greatest critique, like maintaining biodiversity and decolonizing the petromodernity? If you get rid of these two elements, would you maintain petromodernity?
Just taking out the oil of the whole system, so to say, would not mean that petromodernity ends. So a lot of the visions of Silicon Valley, a lot of the visions of a digital culture, to my understanding, actually are just a prolongation or maybe even an intensification of promises of the petromodern era. And they don't necessarily mean an end. And of course, we also know that they are producing a lot of waste, toxic waste, and they are using up a lot of energy. So they are not just, you know, these light technologies that are a solution to the problem. So this would actually mean prolonging petromodern era. And I fear that also finding geoengineering solutions, but then continue with everything else, with spending, consuming, rushing around, would also mean a prolongation of the petromodern era. Whereas what you asked, really changing our mindset and the way, the principles of the way of how we are approaching the world would, I think, would be the end of the petromodern era, even if this future society would continue to use oil, maybe, you know, in much smaller doses, because I'm also totally aware of the fantastic capacities of the substance. And I could imagine that a whole range of possibilities has not yet been found. You know, I could imagine that it's worth to continue working with it and to investigate its capabilities, but probably we should stop to burn it as soon as possible.
If petromodernity is declining, when do you see that petromodernity will finally end? How do we close up this epoch?
Well, this is an impossible question to answer, because we're now about to decipher, let's say, the relationship between this type of materials and a certain type of mindset and a certain type of also epistemological political standards. Normally, we were used to interpret these standards in political or let's say cultural terms, but now we see that the standards of modernity are connected to this type of materiality. So we are only beginning to understand this epoch. And I also would say that the standards, let's say, in the sciences or also in the political system, that these standards would maybe last way longer than the actual oil resources. So in this way, I think the petromodern heritage will last for a very long time, because well, people learned what it is to live, let's say, without child labor, without the need for slavery, with all these planetary connections, with understanding of planetary dynamics. And I think we will never go back into a scientific system where we think that the Earth is just 6,000 years old. So at at this point, Petro Modernity will, if humans live and if scientific cultural traditions live on, then Petro Modernity has a stand for the human future. And so but as already Alexander already put it, you really have to go into the very small scale phenomena of this epoch, and you need to differentiate between the values that are directly connected to this type of let's say destructive or constructive materiality, and let's say the connections between this type of industry and our political or value system that can be cut, and so that we can keep large parts of our political and cultural value system and transfer it to another energy system. So, but it's a very, very thin line, and we are only beginning. Cultural theorists or historians or epistemologists or also economists are just beginning to understand this connection, and so it's a very, very very complex way to differentiate between the things that you want to keep and the things that you want to leave behind.
Benjamin, what is the most fascinating thing, the most fascinating concept that you came across during your studies and the dedication in these several years in the beauty of oil?
The main topic that I was studying in the last years was the connection between this type of fossil resources and chemical industries. So the way that maybe the perspective on the fossil resources is only opening a door into something even there more complex, and that we don't really use up the fossil resources, but we use up molecules that are the effect of both fossil nature and modern scientific industry. And this is a connection between this very, very ancient resource and between modern science that only can happen in this type of petro-modern world. So in there you have the connections between the fossil and the modern, but also between dealing with the molecular level and the planetary level. So you have in one thing, let's say in industrial chemistry and catalysis chemistry, you have the connection between the old and the new, between past and future, between the molecule and the planet, and also between very destructive and very constructive ways of dealing with this type of materiality. So you have what we are fascinated in as cultural theorists, this this way of putting all those dichotomies together in one thing. There you have maybe the most interesting dichotomies.
Benjamin, you hit the nail on the head. If you had to describe a geologist, most of the geologists, we are characterized by these two concepts. One is deep time, and the other one is not only the 3 dimensions, but the 4 dimensions, because you have the 3-dimensionality of the entire planet with multi-scales, from a global scale, continental scale, down to the molecule. And then on top of that, you add the previous element, which is time, because the 3-dimensionality of the planet, or the other elements that you study from the global scale to the molecular scale, they change with time. And geologists, they study this change. Do you have any option or any chance to meet many geologists?
Yes, actually, I have, and I worked for some years at a collection and research project here in Austria, and we were working closely together with petroleum geologists to work on the local history, which is also the political.
What do you think
history.
about the petroleum geologists? Which kind of mindset they have?
Yeah, interestingly, they have what I learned somehow narrow mindset. So they work with the most fascinating planetary subjects, but they look into this through, let's say, a very small type of window. So, and what I like at this type of material is to connect deep time with the very large numbers, with the millions of years, and also the very short time spans. For example, chemistry deals with, as for example, in a performance, I just tried to put all the time scales that we deal with when we use materials that were processed through industrial chemistry, and I had to draw, let's say, 15 numbers before the zero and 15 numbers behind the zero, and all this time span is what we deal with in this modern time. And most of the geologists, when they work for companies, they have very small windows into this reality, and it takes more perspectives to see the full picture, I would say.
We are here in Texas. I am here in Texas. What does Texas represent for your vision of oil? Any specific thought for geographical areas? Or you see Petro Modernity as a homogeneous concept that it affects all the Western world, at least?
Actually, it's exactly the opposite. What our starting assumption was that Petro Modernity is a nice description and a very nice term, but if we believe in, in global developments, and if we believe in diversity, and if we believe that the time of these kind of dictatorial narratives is over, then of course we can't tell the story of Petro Modernity as the story of modernity has been told, but we have to assume that there are local versions of Petro Modernity. And as we observed it, even within the United States, you can find very different variants of the development of Petro Modernity. So Texas, I mean, the first thing I have to think of when you ask me this question is, of course, Giant, the guy who gets rich with finding oil. And Texas, in a way, is probably one of the strongest symbols, or the strongest symbols of this serial variant of Petro Modernity for me, I would say.
I would think about the relationship between centers and peripheries, and Texas, obviously, and Houston, as you said in the beginning, is very much a center of the petro modern scientific and technological world. But I still would think that the picture is very different at the areas that are only affected by this type of technology, but that are still very much connected, but in a very different way. So we, for example, from Europe, we think in a Eurocentric perspective that Europe is the center of, let's say, or it was the center of the scientific world, but already in Petro Modernity, Europe, without huge oil deposits, is a very peripheric way of looking into the petro modern world. But then when we switch from geology to chemistry, then we can say, well, maybe it's more important to look through the lens of refinery technology. And so I would say, being once at a center of this epoch doesn't allow you to see the whole picture as really the whole picture. So we have to put ourselves into a perspective where we at the center are the periphery of the other the other areas. And we need to acknowledge the centers, but we need to provincialize them in our perspective to really understand what is done there. And I also would like to say maybe to the geologists that it's maybe important to rethink what you always see just as part of your daily life, but you maybe take a perspective that makes you see your normal life in a strange way, and art or other types of intellectual activity can maybe allow you to rethink the technology you work in, and therefore understand what this is about.
So Benjamin, Alexander, let me better understand what is the source of your inspiration beyond the data behind your investigations. I see in your website, the very first page, that you have a cluster of images that they go from, your website is beautyofoil.org. You have these clusters with cars, bacteria, logos of oil and gas companies, pigs on an oil rig, tankers, oil droplets, even a map of the wells drilled in Texas. So it's maybe the looking at the images that inspires you, or what is that create that spark that make you go that step farther in your ideas and concepts?
Well, Alexander already said it. It's a type of curatorial research, and a way of curatorial approach is to try to put concepts or sciences as things or images on the table, and then you can work with this type of knowledge, and then you can see well, here is the empire of chemistry, here is the empire of geology, and all this has together here, and the way of this image archive allows us to switch from here to there, and to put this type of narration that deals with the molecular and the planetary, and with the modern, and with very brutal parts of modern history, and with very fascinating parts of history, to put all this material together on one table, or on one screen, or in one book. So the diversity of image material is very typical for this epoch, and also the diversity of picture use, let's say. So a postcard someone writes in 1902 from Baku to his wife in Austria, or a computer simulation from a subterranean landscape is very different, yet you can compare them as images, and you can get close to this type of knowledge. You can get close to the very different types of knowledge that are necessary first to work with this type of material, and then to understand the whole impact of this type of material. And the technological impact is one thing, but the daily life impact is the other thing. And so this great variety of picture materials is a way to deal with this totality of the petro-modern life.
But I would like to add to it an answer to your question for our motivation. I think both Benjamin and I have been interested in understanding actually our contemporary times. You know, I think we both dedicated most of our research, I have been dedicating it to modernity, the 19th and 20th century technologies already when we were still at university and so on. So this is the starting thing, and then quite a lot of time on a research project on containerization and logistics as one of the leading principles of our time. And at the same time, Benjamin, who had started with a research on the material basically and the principles of the German highway system of the 1930s and 40s and 50s, continued with his project on the principle of catalysis And when he started thinking about catalysis, he quite naturally ran into petrochemistry, and then found out that there's this whole Austrian history. So, you know, that was kind of coincidental, but then it totally makes sense looking on it from now. And for me, it made total sense after I ended this containerization project, when we talked, and it was clear that somehow Benjamin hadn't developed all the things that he would have liked to develop within this Austrian context, that I offered him, well, let's do it together and continue and try to draw the big picture and ask the big questions. And this is how it all started, this project a couple of years ago. And somehow looking at it retrospectively, it seems like, yeah, okay, this is 25 years on investigating, so to say, the basic principles of the modernity of the 20th century we are living in, and it somehow makes sense. But since we are like to ask the big questions, we also have to find methods how you can do that, how you can bring together very many different theoretical concepts and also contradicting answers and so on. And one way maybe is exactly this, putting it into a third sphere, a sphere where things can be compared, which could be these things with the images, the work of images, the work of art and so on. But that's also only one. I mean, for Benjamin, theory and history of science is probably the most important approach. So we're also not the same there, but I think we share a lot. Or would you agree, Benjamin?
Yeah, but I also want to add something, because if you ask the question about our motivation, then I would see both of us as cultural philosophers. But philosophy isn't only something that you find in books or in only academic traditions here. But you need to go into the practices and into the industries that shape what is our actual life today in this Petro Modernity. So as a cultural philosopher, you need to deal with this type of materialities and the sciences and all the time frames, time scales, geographic spots between centers and peripheries, between developed countries and deserts. So, but you need to do this as a type of cultural philosophy of the Anthropocene, and there is no way to get rid of this this material contaminations, let's say, of only theory. But you cannot make theory without this very close approach to the materials that shape our world. And so we need to connect the most abstract and the most concrete, and let's say you need to get your hands dirty, and then afterwards write.
I saw that sometimes you, in the website beautyofoil.org, you mention Martin Heidegger. Is he one of the philosophers that influenced you?
Well, I would say only in a very indirect way. The interesting thing which we quote from him is that maybe you should not distinguish so much between technology and the most abstract science, and so that even in the most brutal industrial machinery, there is still a way to decipher nature and the physical world. So this is one part of Heidegger that we certainly find interesting when we connect, for example, the industrial and the scientific or epistemological system. And this is, I think, very interesting that industrial players like huge oil companies play such a big role for deciphering paleontological knowledge. That's a way where you can work with some type of thoughts that are in the philosophical tradition, maybe maybe first or very prominently written by Martin Heidegger. That's right.
I would like to add that we both come more or less from the same media theoretical school in Berlin, and this media theoretical school always, and also cultural theoretical school, always claimed a certain kind of materialism as opposed to former visions of materialism. And if we try to find a materialism that we can work with in the formative years of this epoch we are researching on, I would say the formative years are in the 1920s and 30s, or maybe even also already in the 1910s, then you will find that most of the thinkers on the left side of theorizing would use materialism, actually understand it as a more or less social, an understanding of the social. And they wouldn't come down to the actual materials, and they would kind of ignore them. So problematic, somehow highly problematic authors in regard to whom they correlated with and parts of what they had written, like Ernst Jünger, for example, got a very clear understanding and also description of relationships between technology, materials, resources, and so on, and culture and society, and wrote it down during the 1920s and 30s in Germany and the German-speaking region, whereas leftist authors that are maybe on an, so to say, on an ideological or whatever belief system level more valuable or closer to me, they didn't come down to that. And this actually continued, at least in the German-speaking sphere after World War II, because a certain way of thinking just wasn't okay anymore. And critique never really came down to this sphere of scientific theorizing and concrete materials. You can only find it in art, like in boys, for example, or something, but you hardly find it in theories of the 1960s and 70s. And then there's some kind of materialistic turn. And this turn uses for a philosopher like Martin Heidegger, because he was one of the few philosophers at that time. I mean, obviously, he's also one of the most important of that time, but he was one of the few who kind of tackled this question of technology and of this kind of materialism.
Thank you, Alexander. Alexander Klose, cultural theorist, creator, and concept developer based in Berlin. And thanks to Benjamin Steininger, a cultural theorist and historian of science and technology from Vienna. This was another episode of Mini Geology. We had today the research collective Beauty of Oil, dedicated to understanding the complexities and paradoxes of Petro Modernity. Thank you again so much, Alexander. Thank you, Benjamin.
Thanks.
Well, yeah, thank you, Daniel. It was a pleasure.